Welcome back to the Journey Mindfulness Podcast. I am your host, James O'Neill, a clinical professional counselor, hypnotherapist, and mindfulness teacher. And I am very happy to have a very special guest, Jan Carey, a relationship and sex expert,
Sex
psychotherapist,
certified sex therapist.
certified sex therapist. And we're very fortunate to have her today. Welcome, Jan.
Yeah, thank you so much. I'm really excited to be here. This is such an opportunity.
So it is, I guess, sex is one of those things that we're not really taught well about growing up. I grew up in a Catholic family, and sex was maybe for a lot of people, maybe you can speak more to this, just a sort of taboo, or there's sort of shame attached to it and guilt. And I don't know. It's one of those things that, I definitely ran into problems in my own life with, and I know that there's such a need to learn more about it. And so, yeah, I mean, how did you get into this, and what are some of the things maybe that kind of you see a lot?
Yeah, so thanks for that question. I too came from a conservative Christian background. And so I can really relate to your experience of having to interact with sex as maybe a taboo topic, something that was evil, bad, something that's guilt inducing. And the reason I got into it was because I'd been a couples therapist for a number of years. And even as I'm treating couples, I was observing myself not wanting to go into talking about sex because I really had no idea what to do with it. And, if you're offering couples therapy to not offer sex therapy in addition, you're only treating half of the relationship. You're only going to the relational part of it. But what makes an intimate partnership is relationship plus the sexual relationship.
Mm, that is interesting, because I remember in my early days of being a psychotherapist, and working with couples, and, having my own issues with sex and intimacy, and really hesitating because I don't think I was not well trained. I don't think anyone's necessarily well trained in coming out in terms of like graduate work to really work in a healthy manner with that. Assuming anyone has done their own work with that.
So true. Even with all my couples therapy training, and I had a lot of training, nothing, zero of it touched on sex and how to help people with that.
Mm. Where do you see people start to kind of, I don't know, I guess in relationships, you start to disconnect and detach
Yes.
emotionally?
It's a complex question, and at times I really feel like I'm almost an investigator when I first meet with a couple, because sometimes the problem is relationship based. Sometimes the problem is relating to how they hold the idea of being sexual with another person. And those things are oftentimes intertwined with family culture, religious culture, mental health, physical health, um, values. We can slice it finer and finer. And so when I meet with a couple, I ask them, what is it you want to work on? Oftentimes they'll lead with the relational issues, and I don't discover, even despite asking, that there's some sexual stuff that they want to work on too, because there's so much shame in talking about this. It's so taboo. When we think about our education, it's really been through our gym class usually, because most of us came from families who didn't feel comfortable talking about sex with us. And if you recall back to your gym class, and I don't know, junior high, maybe six,
I
seven.
was I was hoping we would go there. I was thinking, like, what did I know about sex? With, like, sex ed class in middle school, maybe, and, like, someone finding their dad's Playboy or something like that.
National Geographic, we used to go sneak and look at the geographics for the naked
Yeah.
pictures. Yeah. Yeah. So generally, what the school systems teach are funded by the religious right. And so it's all about danger, be careful, uh, fear of rape, disease. And it doesn't talk about pleasure on any level. So with not only having our bags not being packed by our family, our bags are being packed with all this anxiety and worry. And then most of us still don't know how the heck to approach sex. And we either take the lead of the person leading, or sometimes we've leaned into porn. The average boy starts watching porn at age 12. And it's just at that age of, junior high school where the curiosity starts to come forth and adolescence is happening. And, porn has its merits and its value, but it really is designed to be an entertainment source. It is not an educational how-to. But with this vacuum of knowledge, we watch porn and we think, well, this is the way it's supposed to be. Why is my penis not 8 inches long? Why is my orgasms only happening very briefly? Why am I not swinging from the chandelier? And we
So we
start
have this like
there.
grandiose fantasies play out that don't match real life, and then we run into trouble with that because it doesn't match.
Yeah. And then you add locker room talk, maybe on the male side of things, and what I call slut shaming on the female side of things, where if you're having sex, that means you're somebody that is not to be respected. And the whole information gets warped and cloistered, and we're not really talking about our insecurities, our lack of information, and we're going along to get along.
Hmm. Yeah, where like I'm trying to think. Where do you go to get healthy information about sex? Like how would one even educate themselves in the right way? Like what is it healthy, what is that? Where do you go?
It's a great question because this is a generational problem. I can guarantee that my mother had no idea what to share with me about sex. So we can't even necessarily count on our parents. Some people, of course, are well educated and have taken this topic on and have held the curiosity around it and explored it for themselves. But many people don't. And I think this is kind of an American dilemma. I think if we go into Europe and some other countries, sex is held in a much more flexible way.
I was talking to my partner earlier about um, you know, just my experience like learning about sex and relationships and part of which was like, going back to high school reading The Scarlet Letter, which is all this like collective fear and shame built into it. And it's like, don't do this, like, or these are the consequences to having a sexual relationship and all the different themes that come out of that book. But, we don't do ourselves any favors, that's for sure.
No, we don't. Yeah. And there's like, who's leading this? Who's leading us out of this? There's kind of a lack of leadership.
Yeah. What, so you talked about mindfulness in our sort of chat a little bit ago. How do you see that, or how does that weave into, I guess, helping people become more intimate?
Yeah, great question. I would say like probably 99.99% of the people that I work with come in to working with me holding a lot of anxiety and worry around sex. And this lends itself to people entering a performative way of being where they're no longer really embodied, where they're not actually present or aware of what's happening in the moment. They're taking on a role or performing certain sexual acts, thinking that their partner expects it or society would judge them if it wasn't being done a certain way. Or they just shut down because the overwhelm of all this and not having the information leaves them completely unaware of what to do. So, generally speaking, the first thing we start talking about is authenticity and how to show up in the relationship authentically, which oftentimes also kind of bleeds into their emotional relationship.
I would imagine that when you're seeing couples and you bring that up, there is an element of fear to cross that threshold.
I think that's true. And I meet with people individually after the first session because I want to make sure that they feel joined to me and anchored in me, knowing that I've asked them the questions and I know enough about them that I'm not going to throw them under the bus, and I'm going to support them as they learn how to be authentic with their partner.
Mm. So is that what's the first step? Like I discussed this in my podcast. I've gone through a divorce, and sex was an intimacy were certainly issues that led to that, and clearly emotional stuff. What when a couple comes to you and they have become disconnected, maybe from themselves and each other, what's the first step in sort of that healing process?
Yeah, I oftentimes draw a diagram first to kind of help them start to visualize how they've become enmeshed. And I don't know if you're familiar with that term, but enmeshment uh, is a place where you are disentitling yourself to having a separate experience, a separate feeling, a separate thought from your partner, and you're people pleasing. And you're cutting off parts of yourself to fit into this relationship for fear of conflict or for fear that the relationship will end. And two people end up signing up for that same unspoken contract. And then they're kind of locked into this dual people pleasing where they can't make head nor tail of what's happening in their relationship. They just know it's brittle. They're walking on eggshells and they don't know how to bring up topics that require more vulnerability. So I oftentimes start with helping them to be more vulnerable and to tell their truth. And then we start working on being embodied. And one of the ways I help them start becoming aware of that is having them rate themselves on a 10-point scale relating to laxity, which would be kind of lethargic, depressed, staying in bed all day, no energy, checked out, or rigidity, which is frantic, chaotic, anxious, worried, busy. And in both ends of that spectrum, uh, people are not able to have enough space to take in their partner and to be responsive. So we shoot for kind of a 4 to 6 on that 10-point scale because that's where there's flexibility. That's where there's space to expand.
Mm,
So I'll
okay.
have them rate themselves like in session, where would you rate yourself? And then usually start asking them to do that if we start working on a more mindful exercise sexually, which is called sensate focus. Have you ever heard of sensate focus?
No, but I'm curious about it.
Yeah, so it's a mindfulness activity. It's one of those original um, exercises that was created during Masters and Johnson's research.
Hmm.
So the goal becomes to have people start engaging in safe touch. And there's 3 phases. And the first phase involves touching no erogenous zones. So you're touching the head, the hands, the feet, the arms, uh, the lower legs. And they're simply tracking texture, temperature, and pressure.
Okay, very mindful.
But they'll come in and I'll ask them what it was like. And they'll be like, I don't know. We started giggling. It was really awkward. I was bored. That's the most common response. It's really boring.
Yeah.
And it's because they're not really touching for their own fingertips, curiosity and pleasure. They're wired to touch Did I do it good enough? Was that pleasurable enough? Did I meet your expectations? And so the flip or the switch here is for them to start touching for themselves.
Mm,
And that leads to an embodied state where they're using their senses. So the best sex happens when people are in their senses.
okay. So they are, eh, maybe I missed this. They're touching themselves or they're touching their
They're
partner?
touching their partner. No, I may not have said that clearly. They're touching their partner. They're taking maybe in the beginning turns, 10 minutes per person.
Okay.
They're scheduling it on the calendar so nobody has to initiate because that's also part of the anxiety,
Right. The fear of
the fear. Yeah, exactly. So it's a super structured exercise, and we'll do that for a couple of weeks. If they don't speak to any issues, we then go to phase 2, which includes more body parts. And then finally, phase 3, which ends up being penetrative sex.
So in the first phase, though, when you are touching, the goal is to get into your own body because there's an element there of like kind of giving and also receiving, I feel like.
Yeah, this is the paradox of sensate focus. Um, there's no goal attached. So we're not expecting arousal. We're not expecting orgasm. All we're expecting is that you're tracking those 3 things: texture, temperature, and pressure.
Okay.
Because what happens is when we stay embodied and we stay connected to our senses, a healthy body will do what a healthy body does, and it oftentimes becomes aroused and oftentimes ends up orgasming.
Okay. I feel like we should specify.
Yeah, and this is the craziest part of the whole thing. Part of the protocol is that they have to agree to not have sex during sensate focus, during the time that we're working on sensate focus. And I wish I had $1 for every couple that ends up having sex after doing the first part of the protocol, because the pressure is removed.
Oh, that's so interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Wow. Like you just kind of naturally come together. You're, and it's funny, people that work with me will kind of laugh when I say this, but part of mindfulness is non-attachment to outcome, but that's hilarious that you take that pressure away and like, boom, there you go.
There it happens, right? It's crazy.
Okay. And then sorry, my own scatterbrain. The second phase is what?
The second phase, they end up touching a bit more. It ends up like thighs, chest,
Okay.
buttocks, back.
Okay. So just kind of, all right, exploring new parts of the body, but is it continue with that non-pressure, the non-attachment to, there's no, like the
There's no
rule.
goal.
Okay.
Even at phase 3, where there's penetrative sex, nobody is trying to have an orgasm or create arousal. That is not the goal. It might happen. If it happens, that's great, but that is
Okay.
not expectation.
Okay. Now, I had a question for you earlier. Would this be a good time to kind of dive into that a little bit, like in terms of like the female orgasm?
Sure, I'll share what I know. I don't know if I know
Okay.
everything, but
Well, listen, all we can do is try to learn.
yeah.
So yeah, I mean that's something that comes up in my world is the female orgasm, and there's always questions, right? And from a male perspective, it's like, then I get in my own head, right? Like, am I doing something wrong? Are we not intimate? Is there something what is getting in the way? Like, is it being detached from the body? Is there unresolved trauma? 'Cause I guess we should probably talk about that too, right? There's all kinds of different traumas that happen with people, but
Sure. Yeah, I would say, first of all, there's some principles in sex therapy that help clarify your question.
Mhm.
And the number one principle is there must be consent in order to have great sex. And consent means that you are fully showing up and signing up for this. You're not agreeing to please your partner when you really don't want it. Your partner's not pressuring you to have sex when you really don't want it, even if you have sex. So consent kind of aids in being present because you're making an agreement that you really agree with.
Right.
And the second principle, which I think is helpful, is that the only expectations we're allowed to hold for sex is that it's pleasurable and that it creates connection. And if those two things aren't present, it means there's another problem.
Mm.
That pleasure doesn't necessarily mean orgasm or even arousal. You can have pleasure even if those things don't happen. But we have a very goal-centric vision of sex where the woman must orgasm. If I'm a good enough lover, I'll give her multiple orgasms. There's all this pressure and all these expectations, which then makes sex burdensome and disappointing when there's an idea about having the good enough sex.
Mm.
Third
Um,
principle, before we go on, I want to just get the third one in. The third one in is we are all responsible for our own sexual experience, which means it's not your job to give your partner an orgasm. It's your partner's job to give themselves an orgasm.
okay. I think you just blew my mind and a lot of people's minds.
It goes counter to everything we're fed in all the movies we see,
Yeah.
all the TV shows we watch, all the way that people talk about sex.
So maybe my next question is, what else do we get wrong? Or where we misled into different maybe myths about sex?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's all around us. I think if we leaf through a magazine, a fashion magazine, we will see lots of provocative, erotic looking images. And even these things that we're taking in on that level create our expectations.
So I guess what I'm hearing you say is like the expectations are so high, it's almost like we're bound to not hit them in some level.
Absolutely. They're not real, maybe is the most important
These
factor here.
unrealistic expectations.
Yeah, it's fantasy.
Um, well, the last thing that you said, well, maybe it was in the consent part, but just connection. Maybe it was that one. Like, I think that's a big, to me, to my mind anyway, that's a big thing. Just in relationships, but also intimacy and sex is maybe that lack of connection, like that. Like, where do you, like, how do you get it back if you've lost it for a while?
Yeah, so I don't know. To me, the truth shall set you free. I am all
Uh-huh.
about authenticity. And
Okay.
authenticity creates vulnerability. Vulnerability creates connection.
So being honest with ourselves, and which I think is a challenge for a lot of people individually, right? Like, I know going through my own work, learning to be honest with myself was like this whole thing where it's like, oh, wait, I'm not always honest with myself. Like, I might lie and manipulate myself in some ways. Like, that's wild to me. But then authenticity, I suppose, is sort of like the sunlight that is the disinfectant to that.
It is. It is.
So
And we can
what?
access it. We can access it at any point. So
Mhm.
it's not like you miss a bus. It's not like, the train left the station. It's still there for you.
Okay, and that's really important to know, for a lot of people because I think, you can go through a period of time, right? Like, years. I know in, people that I work with that have, maybe gone through divorce sometimes, you might ask them, like, "When did the relationship end?" And it can be, like, a long time ago, and it's like,
You
"Oh,
know?
wait." But, what you're saying is very, I would say, hopeful, but it's important for people to know that, at any moment, right, this present moment. So this very mindful concept here is that you can sort of right the ship or start to take steps in that direction.
Yes, absolutely.
Wow. What else do you think people? either get wrong, or do you see among the people that you work with that would be, I don't know, maybe helpful to know, or in terms of people that might be considering things like, um, I don't know if I'm framing this correctly, but you
Yeah.
know, what are some common things that people might have going on in their lives that they dismiss that might be, something that like, hey, you should go see a sex therapist when these things start to happen, like the warning signs, maybe.
Yeah. Well, I think what's most common and what's not, what is invisible to most people is if one person is having a problem, for example, if a guy's having erectile dysfunction, oftentimes that's so defeating and so embarrassing for a guy to not be able to perform in the way that he thinks he's meant to perform based on all this messaging from society. But additionally, his partner will oftentimes take that personally and then start worrying, oh my gosh, my boobs aren't big enough. He doesn't think I'm hot. He's thinking of his old girlfriend or whatever other anxious thought comes in. He doesn't love me anymore. And now we've got two people kind of mired in shame and unable to talk about it. And they don't know how to fix things.
Mm.
And so the problem will then ping pong back and forth, and it gets them so buried in this, they don't know what to do.
So like this shame storm or just cycle of shame that is just becomes, or maybe feels like it's insurmountable to overcome.
Yes. Yes.
Mm.
And then when, let's say, the female partner starts getting trapped in her own shame, it then ping pongs to the guy, and he's like, oh my gosh, she's pulling away from me. It's because I can't keep this erection going. I'm not a good enough lover. She's going to leave me. He pulls away further. She feels that, and then she pulls away further. And they can really set themselves up to be in a very bad place with what I call assumptive thoughts.
Mm. Okay.
And people will take themselves to the bad movies and play these bad movies in their head about
Yeah.
what's happening in their relationship, interacting with it like it's real, when in reality, this is just a anxious thought that they have like expanded upon and they're living within, and there's no reality base at all.
They create this narrative and then get attached to it and sort of live this story.
Yes,
That's hard to break.
it sure is. It sure is. I've observed that again and again where somebody's clarifying their position on something and their partner still doesn't believe it.
Yeah. Is it okay? Like that trust, like I'm curious. That's like, are they not trusting themselves or they're not trusting their partner?
Yeah.
Both?
I think both. And
Yeah.
I think this always touches on some earlier story from childhood where they've experienced not feeling enough, being rejected, being abandoned. And they're going to this unexcavated trauma that they have learned to live around by playing this bad movie in their head and interacting with it like it's still true.
Mm. So how would you, what does, like, what does healthy sex look like? Like when you get to a point and people are operating at, I'm gonna say a normal level, but it's like a vibrant, healthy sex life. What does that look like, or is it just different for everybody?
No, I think it's vulnerability plus safety. You have to have safety,
Hmm.
right? Vulnerability plus plus safety plus reciprocity allows people to take risks.
Okay. Can you say that formula again?
Yeah, it's really vulnerability
Okay.
plus reciprocity
Okay.
plus safety, because that creates safety. If two people are now being vulnerable,
Right.
allows two people to move out of that, take some risks, and experience it in a different way.
Okay. When you start taking risks, I feel like now we're getting into like the fun part of things.
Well, it could be emotional risk. Is that fun? I think it's fun.
I would say so. I mean, I think we've all had relationships that didn't work out, right? Where it wasn't fun because you maybe, I don't know, inhibited your emotions or
Yeah.
didn't feel safe. So then to be able to do that, you know, I would imagine it's going to breed more intimacy, right? Like, okay, like here we go.
Yeah, it makes a relationship vibrant.
And then, I mean, you could say more about this probably, but like, the more emotionally safe you feel, right? Like almost like the sensate level one, you start touching like, okay, there's feel like that opens the door to more fun things. Like you do feel more free and
Yes.
less pressured and things like that.
Yes.
What else? I don't want to say what else would be wrong, but what else is healthy, or do you encourage people to become closer and more free
Yeah.
in
So there's a thing called tantra sex, which I am not an expert in,
okay.
but one intervention that people can try, which is commonly used in sex therapy, is called eye gazing. Have you ever heard of that?
I I feel like I've had to do that with other therapists, so in a very non-sexual way, but like,
It was just during a training or what?
yeah.
Yeah.
Yes. So I mean, a couple times, definitely at the beginning of sort of counseling school. Um, but yeah, we would walk through. Actually, this was a mindfulness training. This was like an advanced mindfulness training, and you had to look and we were face to face staring into someone's eyes, and we walked through a variety of happy moments, like the saddest moment of your life. And so, and then you're just gazing in the eyes, and it was incredibly powerful.
It is.
I mean, it was, you went through the emotional ringer.
Yes.
And you felt like you knew somebody very well. Like it's a very intimate exercise.
Super intimate.
But how does it go with the one you're talking about? How do you set it up?
Yeah, very similarly, where you ask the couple maybe to do some eye gazing, and eye gazing is where you're sitting maybe face to face with somebody, or I mean, you could do it standing, of course, and you're holding the gaze. It's not a staring contest, so it's not like you lose if you look away, but that you maintain the eye contact, no matter if there's giggling, no matter if you're feeling anxious or self conscious. And it creates, like you said, that intimate feeling between two people.
Mm.
And, people are so busy now. I mean, I would say that's one of the major stumbling blocks to people's relationships. When I was treating people during the pandemic, I found that they got healthier relationally because there were far less interrupters in them paying attention to each other and spending time together. They were kind of organized around this enemy of COVID. And my caseload started doing better actually from it.
Mm.
And eye gazing is a way, I think, to reconnect with your partner when you've been so busy, you've not been paying attention, you've just been getting through the daily life challenges and kind of reconnecting with your partner on that vulnerable, intimate place.
You might know about this, and I'm probably not going to get the details right, but there was some kind of study where there was like maybe family members that had some kind of feud or whatever and hadn't talked to each other in like 10 years, and then they were brought together sort of face to face like that.
Yeah.
And I don't know if there was talking or not, but they had to be like, face to face, eye to eye. In like years of hate started to like melt away very quickly and
Oh,
dissolve. And
wow.
I mean, I think it just shows how powerful some of these practices can be in sort of clearing up or tidying up some of these things, or these stories that we've created in our minds, that have created maybe disconnection in our relationships, and start to become closer.
Yeah, exactly. It's like creating presence, right? Paying attention.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I try to get people to do, and I think I, th- you know, I wonder sometimes, people take it as seriously, but I'm like, if you have 5 good minutes in the morning, with your cup of coffee or tea or something, to just look in your partner's eyes and like be face to face with them, that might be the only 5 minutes you have. Make it count, but like don't dismiss it. Like make sure that if you're gonna make an effort to like, you can't be mad at the other person if no one's making an effort, right? Like make sure that you set this up and do it. Like really be intentional about it.
Yes. Yeah, that sounds like a great strategy.
Well, you know, fortunately, you have to make a lot of mistakes to find out some of these things.
Well, it's the human condition, I don't believe it's our job to show it perfect. I think it's our job to mend things when things fall off.
Um, I don't know why. It's I guess just popped into my head, but this might be an issue for some listeners. I know that I had very strong opinions on infidelity when I started
Yeah.
as just a human being in my own upbringing, I guess. But that's one of the things that maybe you could speak to. Just like I would imagine you come across couples that have stumbled into some type of infidelity, and there can be, I guess, different kinds of infidelities. But what do you see with that as for in terms of like hope in rekindling something? Like, can someone overcome that obstacle?
Yeah, definitely. And I think, as I'm doing an assessment of somebody who is engaged in infidelity, part of what I'm trying to track is this an out of control sexual behavior situation where the person is using sex to regulate their emotions because they're so anxious or so depressed or feeling so dead? Or is this an attachment injury where they don't feel seen and heard by their partner and they're going outside the relationship to get their attachment needs met?
Hmm.
And both things can create infidelity.
Are there, when people have survived, couples have survived infidelity, are there certain traits that they have, or that you notice that they're able to, like, is there a certain flexibility in their mindset in some way, or?
Well, when I do infidelity work with people, I see it as kind of a three-part process. The first part is if it's just been discovered, there's a crisis where everybody's world has become a complete nightmare and they don't know up from down. And so where they need support is in kind of regulating themselves, finding ways to take care of themselves, establishing some kind of scheduling because people oftentimes won't eat, they don't sleep. They're completely consumed with anxiety and worry. The second phase usually becomes helping them to talk about what happened, to make meaning out of the infidelity, because for each person, the story is different and why they leaned into it. For some people, uh, they're just unhappy with themselves and they don't feel like they're living in integrity to the way they want to live. And so it's a reach for being alive, Esther Perel talks about that. And so the third phase of infidelity recovery involves taking that meaning making they have and applying it to their relationship and figuring out how does the relationship need to flex and change in order to accommodate these needs that weren't being met, probably for both parties.
Hmm. So if there's like a willingness to look at themselves and each other and adapt in a
Yes.
new way, to be open to that.
Yes. And more marriages than not survive infidelity. There are fewer divorces from infidelity than marriages that stay together. And it's a very solvable problem. And what I tell people is that their first marriage is done. It's dead. We're now working on their second marriage, but their second marriage is with the same spouse.
That's an interesting way of looking at it, and then a very interesting statistic. I did not know that.
Yeah.
Wow.
And these are just the reported infidelities. There's infidelity that's not even reported. So I think it's very common.
What is your thought on, I mean, maybe it's just similar, but just emotional infidelities?
Yeah, that's real.
Yeah.
That's absolutely real. And it's just as painful. In fact, I would
Yeah.
say for women, it's sometimes the most painful form of infidelity.
Mm,
It's like not only couldn't they provide sexually to their spouse, but they couldn't provide emotionally. They weren't good enough to confide in or to get support from or to feel close to. And that's a real wound.
yeah. What else? What else do you think it is important, maybe for people listening to this show, to know about sort of sex, intimacy, relationships in your work?
Hmm. I guess I have this confidence that I can help them, which I think sometimes surprises people, but I see very few cases where I feel hopeless about the situation. I think almost everything is fixable if two people want it. But the dilemma is in getting both people to determine what they want. And I think for many people, they're they're not only unaware of what they're feeling, but they're also unaware of what they want. And this kind of like clicks into that idea of people pleasing and organizing one's life around pleasing others and showing up to expectations they perceive from others in society. And so for some people, if I ask them that question, they have no idea what they want.
So asking the question, what is it do I want? And being authentic about it.
Yes.
Mm,
Because there can be the wanting, oh, I just want everything to return to the way it was. I just want stability. But does that really mean you want your spouse or your partner? Does that really mean that you don't want anything else to change? Like, I doubt it.
yeah. Uh, Jan, I'm trying to think of questions that people might ask. What about frequency of sex? How often should people in a healthy relationship, is there a number? Is there a magic number to
Yeah, I
that?
love that question. There is no right way or wrong way to have sex as long as there is consent and nobody's being hurt in a bad way. I mean, there is a large amount of people who find, pain and pleasure at the cusp of that to be erotic and to be a place that they welcome into sex. That's not what I'm talking about. But where somebody's actually being hurt or injured from sex and it's not part of what they've signed up for, that is not okay, right? So I forget the question. What was the question you asked me?
I was asking about like the frequency of sex,
Oh,
and he was
thank
talking
you.
about there's
Frequency.
not a right or wrong way.
Yeah, so there's no right or wrong way. And yet what's also true is people who have regular sex, if they skip 1 week of sex, they feel awkward when they come back to each other and they're ready to have sex again. So it's fascinating. I think it's kind of the human condition where it does require vulnerability to be sexual with somebody. And if we get away from it, even for a week, we start to get kind of hunkered down in that awkwardness, self-consciousness, and it prevents us from connecting.
Mm. So, okay, I feel like you opened the door for another question. I mean, you were talking about like maybe like BDSM, kink
Yeah,
type stuff. Okay.
yeah,
And I mean, I know obviously consent and safety is a priority in that type of setting as well.
yes.
Um, do, what else? Do you see that being more or maybe less taboo?
I think so. Well, I personally think that the youngsters, the younger generation, have not only been much more accepting of talking about their participation in therapy, but they're also much more willing to talk about their sexual interests and sex in general. So I feel like changes are happening now due to this younger generation who's interacting with vulnerability in a whole new way.
Mhm. Interesting. Yeah, someone was joking about BDSM a few years ago, and I remember that just being solicited for a training for, kink and BDSM, for therapists, like, I guess it fell under, like, sex therapy, but, it was just like, "Okay, this is not something I would have expected, maybe 10 years ago or 15 years ago."
Yeah.
So
I think even sex therapy has, I remember when I first got into it, um, I didn't know any sex therapist. I felt almost like a freak of nature entering this
uh,
because it was so taboo and so out there. But I think with all the discussion of LGBTQ issues and this younger generation being much more open about identifying who they are, that it's become more commonplace, and it's more within the uh, chatter that we're hearing on social media, certainly.
what, do you have an opinion on polyamory? Does that come across a lot in your practice?
It doesn't. I think that there are specialists who have kind of made that their jam, and that's what they offer, but it requires actually exquisite honesty, exquisite ability to track one's own emotions, exquisite ability to manage jealousy, because those human feelings are still what somebody has to navigate, even if they're signing up for ethical non-monogamy.
Yeah. I would certainly not call myself any kind of expert in that. However, I do remember when that started becoming more of a thing or people would bring that up to me. I remember thinking, man, that's like, you said exquisite. To me, I hear like rare air. Like some people can pull that off. I feel like most people could not. So okay. It's interesting.
Yeah. I think it's a very challenging relationship to nurture and take care of. It requires a lot of work.
Hmm. All right. What else? Anything I did
Well,
not
you know
ask
what?
you?
Yeah, you were talking about statistics. I wrote a few statistics down just in case that
Please,
came up, so
please
maybe we could
share.
talk about that.
Yeah.
And you mentioned the question of women having orgasms.
Mhm.
So 10 to 50% of women have difficulty reaching orgasms.
Okay, that's higher than I would have thought.
Yeah, right? Yeah, there's a lot of reasons for that, you know? I mean, when we think about how women as little girls have been raised, you know, uh, we're meant to keep our legs closed. Little girls don't do that. That's not ladylike. I mean, a lot of us have gotten messaging like that from our parents. And just finding our genitals is a lot more challenging. I remember I have 3 kids. I remember plopping them all in the bathtub because they were close in age and doing like a group bath. And my son, well, I shouldn't say this, he's gonna probably get upset. At any rate, it's much easier for a little boy to find his genitals than it is for a little girl,
Mhm.
right?
Yeah.
And then you have all this slut shaming, and how's a little girl meant to feel okay? How's she meant to find her genitals to explore it and come away with that experience ready to be sexual? It's a little more challenging for women.
Yeah, and I guess, just the way that we kinda look at it, I would imagine internally, females probably close off some part of themselves hearing all that.
Yes.
And so there's a process of sort of opening back up and being vulnerable in that way, safely. But
Well, it's fascinating. I hear men slut shaming and then being desperate to have sex with a woman. And I think, how does that work in your world? You know, it work. There's like this a paradox again, this discrepancy that makes no sense,
we want the Puritan housewife and then the porn star and the
Yeah. And they want somebody to have sex with, but the women who do have sex, they're sluts. They're made fun of. We get a lot of dual messaging as women.
yeah, it's there's a lot of pressure in stuff to navigate with that. Were there any other statistics you had then?
Yeah. Yeah. 10 to 15% of women have never orgasmed.
Ugh. Wow.
Yeah. And when we think about, your question, which is what I heard, how responsible is a person meant to be to bring somebody to orgasm?
Yeah.
If that person has entered the relationship and never had an orgasm, what kind of pressure is that for you as their partner to hold the responsibility to make them orgasm? That's a lot of pressure,
Climbing Everest here.
right?
Uh,
A lot.
oh my God.
And that's why, for women who can't orgasm, usually the strategy is to teach them to masturbate so that they don't have the pressure of being, okay, are you coming yet? Like, we've been at this like 20 minutes now. Like, I don't have all day,
Yeah.
and then to have to be able to relax, become embodied, find an erotic thought, use their senses with that kind of pressure, it becomes really hard. So the strategy is usually to teach them to masturbate. And oftentimes women who don't orgasm have also never masturbated.
Okay. So like learning the art of self-pleasure.
Correct. Yeah. And so that generally, once a woman knows how to bring herself to orgasm, she can then teach her partner what she likes. Then we're back to temperature, pressure, texture, right?
Yeah.
Those three things in sensate focus. Those are the things that she could teach her partner to utilize when she's ready to orgasm.
Wow. It's a lot more mindfulness than I thought.
Right? More than I thought too.
Wow.
Yeah.
Well, Jan, anything else on there? You've shared so much.
Up to 50% of women have difficulty reaching orgasm with a partner, which is a slightly different, maybe the same as the first. The average amount of time to have sex within a couple's relationship is 13.6 minutes. Men worry about lasting long.
Uh-huh.
The average time is 13.6 minutes.
Man.
Which means that 3 to 7 minutes is considered adequate.
I feel like I'm like taking that in.
This is good for all of us to take in.
Yeah, no, there's a lot of good stuff in there.
Yeah. The average time for a man to ejaculate during sex is 5 to 7 minutes.
Okay.
The median time is 5.4 minutes. Sometimes I get a guy who says, I can't last long. And I ask him how long he wants to last. It's like 20, 25 minutes. And I'm like, people don't last that long. That's asking something that's superseding what's normal.
Interesting. So we have, oh, wow, just these unrealistic or, expectations of ourselves.
Yeah. Which porn often feeds, right? Porn has its place. Porn is a tool for eroticism and to get into that space. It's entertainment, but it's not a how to have sex.
Um, are there any, I mean, aside from going to a sex therapist, and I highly recommend Jan, and will tell you how to find her. Any places that people should look to inform themselves? Like, there any good books that you would recommend or anything like that?
Oh yeah, there's tons of good books. First of all, I would recommend that everybody get checked by their doctor to rule out anything physiological, because
Mm,
that's where I always start, because we don't want to drag them through sex therapy if really there's something physiologically going on. You know, for men,
mhm,
sometimes it's low testosterone, and that's a real thing. And so if a guy's not interested in sex, he's also sluggish all the time, he's tired, that's a good first step. So I always like to know that they've discussed this problem with their healthcare provider.
okay.
Um, and I think that there are lots of good books. Emily Nagoski has the best book ever on women's arousal, because that's where women get hung up. Um, they get hung up on, I don't want to have sex, right? I don't want to have sex. And one of the strategies that I think it's Emily talks about is using a stoplight, which means a green means let's go. I'm ready to go. I want it. That one's easy. We all recognize a green light.
Mhm,
A red light might be I've got the flu. I was vomiting. I got screamed at by my boss and I'm crying. Something really bad happened. There's no way on God's green earth that I'm going to have sex. That's a red light. That's easy to recognize. Where women oftentimes don't track is the yellow light. And oftentimes the yellow light is read as a red light. I don't really feel like it. I'm not horny. I'm not feeling any tingling. I'm not having any erotic thoughts. I don't want to have sex. But really, if we sit with that and we ask them, is this really a hard red or is this maybe a yellow? Oftentimes they'll be like, well, I can't really think of a reason why I can't have sex. And so that's the space that I try to help women when they've got desire problems.
mhm.
And so there are strategies that women can utilize to work on their interest in sex and their ability to become embodied. And that's the place where sometimes when we've got, couples that come in where one partner is like, we're not having enough sex. And then oftentimes it is gendered, and the female partner will say, well, I don't want any more sex. Oftentimes the place we can shift that to some degree is by working on that yellow light and noticing the differences between the red light and the yellow light, and noticing what kinds of things might help allow her to get embodied.
Wow. Jan, thank you so much. I feel like you offered a ton of information in this episode. I know I learned a lot. Thank you so much for being here. Where can people find you if they want to work with you?
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. I really appreciate it. This was a real pleasure. They can find me by either emailing me at Jan Carey, LCSW at gmail.com, or they can go to my website, which probably is a better place to send them to,
Okay.
www.jancareytherapy.com. And they can fill out a form expressing whatever it is that they want to work on. I usually set up a 20-minute consultation call that I don't charge for, where we talk about where they get stuck and what their goals for treatment are. And we determine if I'm the right person for that work.
I will link to your email. I'll put your email in the description, and also your website. And Jan, thank you so much for coming on and sharing all this. And I hope people give you a call.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
All right. Take care.
See ya.
Bye.
Bye bye.
Thank you so much for tuning in today and being with us. May you find joy, flow, and adventure on your journey. And if you got something from it, please like, share, and subscribe and or comment. It means a lot. Thank you.